Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we are looking at a passage from Hebrews chapter 4. The book of Hebrews is replete with quotations from the Old Testament, and these quotations are frequently from different passages linked together or strung along in different methods, which is interesting in that we don't, well, I'll come back to that. They seem to be more topical tied together than they are expositional. But Hebrews chapter 4, the writer connects two passages together based on the fact that they have a common term, rest. In chapter 3, the author follows a quotation from Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11, pointing out the historical observation that the generation of Israelites who journeyed through the wilderness failed to enter God's rest. In chapter 4, the author picks up that same thing, or same term, from Genesis 2 and 2. It says, on the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. And then he links these two Old Testament passages together, allowing one to interpret the other. So Hebrews 4, verses 6 and 7 say, so God's rest is there for people to enter, but those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. The author's train of thought would look something like this. There's a place of rest that God experienced on the seventh day after creation, Genesis 2 and 2. And when Israel was wandering through the wilderness, they provoked God to anger and did not enter into the place of rest. In the time of David, God was yet calling Israel to enter in that rest, Psalm 95, 7 through 11. And so his conclusion seems to be there is a future place of rest where God's people can enter. And Martin Luther once said, there are 2 days in my calendar, this day and that day. Believers live each day with a reminder that there is yet a final day to come. So that day refers to the day that we enter in God's presence. That day of rest is a reminder that judgment will come for everybody. And that day of rest is a reminder that this life is temporary, but the next is eternal. And so Alyssa, let's talk about this. If that day, judgment day, the end day, whatever that looks like, do you think modern day believers take that too lightly, judgment day too lightly?
There's always going to be a spectrum of modern day believers. You're going to have those where judgment day is preached every single week, and that is what they hammer on, and that is what they talk about. And then you're going to have Christians on the other side of the spectrum that are like, we're not even going to worry about that. So to say modern day believers is kind of hard to nail down. I remember when I was in high school going to one, I think this would have been an Acquire the Fire. And they...
Ron
Luce.
Yeah, okay.
And they decided they were doing a drama that year, and it was called the Bema. And it was all about the judgment for believers. And it was like, I think maybe you had a part in writing it because I think they got to see videos of their lives, and you're always like, man, I want to see a video of that Bible story or this. And so it was this whole thing, and I got home and I was like, okay. And so I start the internet was around at that point. I am and so that old, that young, that I was like, oh, I can go to the internet and learn more about this. And I started looking up and I'm like, wait a minute, there is not a ton of scriptural, there's obviously going to be judgment, but the details on that, they had made up a lot of theology out of this. And so it always makes me nervous when we try to add details that kind of come from just the way we were raised to things. And so it doesn't make me nervous that people aren't overly talking about Judgment Day, just because I think, and this probably isn't the right answer, but it doesn't make me too nervous because I think that we see there's so much to worry about with this day, as Martin Luther might kind of like that. I'm going to trust God for that judgment day. I do think, though, when I think about judgment, where I always go is Matthew 25 with the sheep and the goats and that division. And so when I'm thinking about judgment day, I'm thinking about how I'm treating the least of these. How, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And so that is one of the few places where we get a fairly concrete thing on judgment in my mind, and division, and it's how we treat the least of these. And if we talk about, do modern day believers care enough for the least of these, then that's a different question. But I think that kind of almost is along the same lines.
I don't like the word worldview when I'm talking about scripture. That makes me itchy. But I do think, and I think we all naturally lean one way or the other.
Right.
They're the do's and the don'ts, right? And what I find is the way I would probably answer this question is I don't think that judgment is de-emphasized necessarily. I think that it's only partially presented. This is true of political parties as well, but in the church, that what you just said, how do they treat the least of these, is that becomes the priority for some people, right? And they minimize the don't issues. Don't commit adultery, don't kill, don't steal, those kind of things. And none of those three move the needle. I could name some, but I'm not looking for that in this podcast. But you know what I'm saying, the don't issues. And then you have the other side who feel like, okay, they spend all their time on the don't issues, don't do these. They're going to, they take stands against things like abortion or gay marriage, but they don't put a whole lot of emphasis on caring for the least of these. So my answer would be judgment tends to be emphasized out of balance, right? So if there is whatever that day looks like, separation, hell, torment. Gosh, I had a recent conversation that exhausted me with a guy who is no longer a believer in the judgment, so it was an exhausting conversation. That's a whole nother podcast. But I believe there is judgment. What it looks like, I don't know. I just think some of it's personality driven, some of it is how we grew up, In hindsight, one of the things that as I've gotten older, I've been able to reflect on was I grew up in a really harsh Pentecostal, really holiness environment that spent a lot of time on the don't issues in the tribe. But I grew up in a home where my parents modeled, and I have been in my 50s before I was able to piece this together. Where I saw, because I've asked myself the question, why so sometimes I feel like I don't get it right. I don't get it right all the time, but I feel like I don't know what the right word is, a weirdo, a unicorn, because I believe both, right? I take pretty strong stands on the don't issues, but I feel like you gotta treat the least of these right. But I've been able to piece that together, and I saw that modeled with my parents. I saw them go out of their way to try to help people and care for people, and I mean, they would give their last dollar to try to help people. And if I think we're missing it on the judgment, I think we're skewed one way or the other, and we're too sure about what it's going to look like.
Right.
I will tell you a funny story since you brought up a choir to fire. And this man probably thought he was in hell that day. So there was a handicapped man that came to church here. He was in a wheelchair. He didn't have both of his legs, right, Daniel, Mr. Bill? He was missing both legs. He had prosthetics. But he loved music. He loved worship. And I had been at Open Door 4 or 5 months, maybe, not long. And they asked us to go as a chaperone, Barbara and I, to an choir to fire in Norfolk. So we went, and Mr. Bill went. I had not been around him ever at all. And so they rolled him down to the front, like right by the stage, for him to watch the concert, the singing. And they had Skillet, maybe, is that the name? Is Skillet a band?
Yeah.
Okay, like hard rock, kind of stuff. And the kids went down. They had this mosh pit all down. So am I describing this?
Yeah,
like you would have seen it. And Mr. Bill in his wheelchair ended up in the middle of that, and they're beating him all around. He's down there in that wheelchair. And when he got back to the bus, he was so mad, like he was hot. But I bet he thought he was in hell, right? I mean, I really do. And that's a terrible illustration, but we don't know what hell is like. I mean, what is it?
It was picturing.
It was terrible.
That would be.
It's funny. He's dead and gone now, so he's walking the streets of gold on 2 good legs at this point. But
you're assuming.
Yeah, he was a good man. Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was a good guy. I don't know what hell's going to look like. I have some descriptions, right? And I have some things. It's going to be torment. Like what's the have you seen the poem about spoons that describe heaven or hell?
No.
And it describes people with like 2-foot spoons strapped to their arms. And it says, it shows. I wish I could. I'll look this up and read it to you this week. It's much better poetic. They have these long spoons attached to their arms, and it's
just get to the point, because I'm not.
I know. One table is heaven and one table is hell. So the table that is hell are the people, they're trying to feed themselves, but the spoon's too long for them to feed themselves. And the table of heaven are the people with the spoons attached to their arm, and they're feeding one another because they can't, right? So that's the difference. And well, I'll read this poem before the week's out, because you needed a good laugh today, didn't you?
I think I also envisioned the spoon like growing exponentially at the end too. So I'm like, these people that just are.
Hey, it's a good revelation story, right? It's a good revelation story. And they had 10 horns and spoons coming out the end of their arms. So this concept, though, of living this day because of that day, how much influence should that day have on this day?
There's a missionary that, as I was deciding what to do with my life, reading his journals was very foundational isn't the right word, but very, it helped me decide what to do. And Jim Elliot, in his journal, he's a missionary who oh goodness, I don't even know what country he went to anymore. It's been so many years since I've read it. I think it's like Ecuador or some country in Central or South America, and an unreached people group. He went there, and they went and they were martyred, him and a group of men. And the amazing thing is that the wives stayed around and ministered and reached this tribe for Jesus. And the quote that he has is, "He is no fool to give up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And I think that that's shaped my life in a lot of ways that, you know, you can give up things on this earth, you can give up a lot because there's one thing that matters. And if you're giving up something that doesn't matter for something that really does, that has, I think, shaped my life in a lot of ways and a lot of times.
I think that's a good way to think about it. You know, and missionaries often have evaluated things in different terms than we have, and we can see things through their eyes. Just so y'all don't think this is a joke, I'm going to read. It's an allegory. I'm going to read it to you. One day, a man said to God, "God, I would like to know what heaven and hell are like." God showed the man two doors. Inside the first one, in the middle of the room, was a large round table with a large pot of vegetable stew. It smelled delicious and made the man's mouth water, but the people sitting around the table were thin and sickly. They appeared to be famished. They were holding spoons with very long handles, and each found it possible to reach into the pot of stew and take a spoonful, but because the handle was longer than their arms, they could not get the spoons back to their mouths. The man shuddered at the sight of their misery and suffering. God said, "You have seen hell." Behind the second door, the room appeared exactly the same. There was a large round table with a large pot of wonderful vegetable stew that made the man's mouth water. The people had the same long-handled spoons, but they were well-nourished and plump, laughing and talking. The man said, "I don't understand." God smiled and said, "It's simple. Love only requires one skill." These people had learned early on to share and feed one another, while the greedy only think of themselves. And so, yeah.
I don't know if that helps. Because there's also in my mind a TikTok of an extendable fork where you take it to a restaurant and you like start feeding other people at the table.
Oh, that's kind of real weird.
But I appreciate the sentiment. I think it's a lot like C.S. Lewis, where in The Great Divorce, where he talks about hell is people who basically God says, "Thy will be done."
Right.
Like lets people come to the ends that they themselves have brought themselves to. So it's a decision that we make, and we only get one chance, one lifetime.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Hebrews.